Welcome, human leaders, to a live expert session on why organizations lack inclusion, which is part of our broader focus this month on diversity, equity, and inclusion here at Human Leaders. So inclusion is a critical conversation to be had within our organizations for a myriad of reasons. New research tells us that non-inclusion is a key attribute driving toxic workplace cultures, resulting in higher workplace attrition rates. Conversely, inclusion has been found to have positive impact on employee and business outcomes. So this has resulted in a 19% increase in employee wellbeing, a 43% increase in high commitment to organizations by employees. Employees on average are 28% more engaged when they feel included, and their intention to stay with their company increases by 3 times. So these are all really incredible reasons for companies to invest in inclusion. But there's something even more important here than these benefits to business. And that's that an environment where human beings have the opportunity to thrive. That's really the benefit here of inclusion. We know that when we feel valued and that when we feel seen and when we feel heard, we perform at our best. And we really want to see that people of all races, ethnicities, genders, sexual orientations, and neurodivergencies aren't facing this barrier to equitable participating in work. To me, that's the real reason that we should be investing in inclusion, so that all human beings actually have an equitable opportunity to participate in the work environment. In today's session, we're invited to be hosting Gloria Tabi, who'll drive us into the heart of this issue, and that is why organizations lack inclusion. In this session, she's going to be giving us the strategic necessities on inclusion policy in business, providing the fundamental building block that actually underpins and sustains inclusion at work. So driving behavior and attitude change is a critical part of this conversation, but without this strategic underlying, organizations will continue to see true inclusion elusive. So Gloria is an author and the managing director of Everyday Inclusion. Gloria's research specializes in social analysis on race, social inequalities, and anti-racism. As a Black African Australian woman, Gloria brings well-grounded knowledge and experience of the impacts presented in race and gender identities. With over 30 years of experiences in project management, employment services, professional mentorship, and business coaching, Gloria's ability to engage, negotiate, and build worthwhile relationships across diversity, clients, and demographics are her greatest skills. Gloria provides proactive, relevant, and impactful training frameworks that are tailored to your business for a safe and productive and sustainable future. So welcome to the session today, Gloria. And just before I hand over to her, we also have 2 of Gloria's incredible books here that we'll be giving away at the session today. So these are up for grabs for both our members and non-members joining us today. And at the end of the session, I will go through the registrations from the session and I will draw those out at random and announce them at the end of the session. So that really underpins the importance of this session today, guys. And without further ado, I am so delighted to welcome Gloria to the space today to help us learn, to help us grow, to help us understand why strategic inclusion policy is so important for organizations. So welcome to the space, Gloria.
Wow, that introduction is great. Thank you so much, Alexis, for having me here at Human Leaders. So hello, Human Leaders. Thank you for having me. And I always like to start my talk by telling you a little bit about myself to kind of have a bit of grounding. So I'm talking to you from a place called the Darug Nation in Australia, which is owned by the Indigenous people of this country. And this land is never ceded. So this is where I'm speaking to you from. It's a beautiful day. It's a bit rainy, but it's quite nice. We've got a little bit of sunshine. So why organizations lack inclusion? So a little bit about myself. I call myself a master juggler. I'm a researcher, I'm a business owner, I'm an author and a mum. All of these roles are quite important to me. And, you know, sometimes I give more to one than the other, but they're all equally important to me. I'm African Australian, so I was born in a country called Ghana in West Africa, but I've actually lived in Australia longer than my country of birth. And so when we talk about, you know, where are you from? I've actually lived in the West longer than I have lived in Ghana. And, you know, we could argue, where am I really from? Am I Australian or Ghanaian? But I've lived in Australia much, much longer. I am currently completing my Master of Research in Race, Racism, Social Analysis, and Anti-Racism. And I also have done workplace assessment and training, which allows me to do training in workplaces. Now, I should ask, you can see my screen, okay? Beautiful. Okay, so the next thing I do is to establish some sort of definition for inclusion. So when I talk about inclusion, I'm talking about providing environments where everyone can feel belonging. So this is the definition that I use, and you will see why as we get into the discussions today. But before we get into the discussion, I've got a question for you. As leaders, and I know that you are all leaders, what's workplace inclusion to you? And we are going to quickly workshop on that because I do like people to participate. And if you have your mobile phone with you, you'll be able to just hover to this barcode and get into Mentimeter, and we will spend about 2 minutes writing down what inclusion means to you as a leader.
A leader, it feels like inclusion is about creating safety and space for people to show up as their full selves. And something that feels really important to me is, as a leader, is providing the equitable access to resources. So including including myself as a leader, making myself as accessible to everyone in an equitable way feels really important. So I'm seeing people are popping in the chat as well. If you're more comfortable doing that, I've got Jeffrey shared that to me. To him, inclusion means vulnerability and trust. So thank you for that share, Jeffrey. Does anyone else want to pop anything into the chat, or would anyone like to share their answers around that as we move around? Chris has got sociological safety, a sense of connection and inspiring. Harish has written seen, heard and valued. And Catherine has written diversity. So some fantastic, very different answers coming through.
That's great. That's awesome. All right. Well, I'll go back to sharing. So thanks for that. So how did we get here? Before maybe 2-3 years ago, diversity and inclusion in the workplace wasn't really talked about that much. And you can remember that during the lockdown with COVID, inclusion, diversity has become quite prominent in the workplace, that we can't really shake it off. And it's not something that is going to go away. I think it's here to stay. And the reason how we got to this point is that if you live in Australia, in 2017, there was the Banking Royal Commission into banking and financial services. And they looked at the misconduct that were happening in that industry. And so and there were many things that were uncovered, but I'm just really interested about the bad culture. That was also one of the findings when they did that investigation. So bad culture, and please just remember that culture is really important part of inclusion. And so following from that, ASX Corporate Governance Council decided that all corporations need to have diversity and inclusion as part of their policy. And so that's how it started getting momentum from there. And of course, the global racial reckoning in 2020, which is the killing of a Black man on the street of United States, George Floyd. So all that combined is what we are now seeing in the workplace. Inclusion is gaining a lot of focus. So that's a little bit of history there. In Australia, there is definitely a lack of inclusion. Discrimination and harassment is prevalent. Almost 50% of Indigenous employees are impacted by racism and exclusion. And this research was actually done by a lady called, if you want to read the book, Debbie Bargali. And she did a research in Australian public service and found out that when Indigenous people have actually managed to get the job, and we know all the barriers around them being able to secure employment, but when they do get employment, over half of them are being discriminated. And so then they leave altogether. Another research in the workplace, in the general population, 1 in 3 Australians experience racism in the workplace. So 2021, the Australian Human Commissioner, this is all a bit of history to get to a point, decided that the government of Australia actually implement anti-racism framework because of the prevalence of racism in Australia. So it's quite, it's out there. It's not just, we are not just talking about it. There's all this research are telling us that the workplace is not a safe place because of lack of inclusion. Okay, so I talk about organization lacking inclusion because of racism, which create exclusion, and then because of that, organization lack inclusion. And this is really, really important. And I guess it sets me apart to diversity and inclusion that you see out there, that people run, is that I take you back to understanding what actually causes exclusion, which is the opposite of inclusion. And so if we can, as leaders, understand exclusion, it's very difficult for us to be able to cultivate and create inclusion in our workplaces. I hope that makes sense. So for us to understand exclusion comes about from racism. And this is where I'll put my research hat. So if we look at all the differences we have in society, we have things like gender, sex, age, disability. These categories are just how we function. We put people, you can say we put people in a box so that we can have policy and procedures and govern our society. So everyone is in a box in a sense. So out of all those differences, race and racism is a major category of difference. And so when we spend a lot of energy trying to resolve gender equality and gender equity, we are still going around in circles because the major category, which research tells us, is actually race and racism. And so if we deal with race and racism issues, all the other workplace ills, sexism, ageism, will be also dealt with. Because when you think about it, and I always use my as an example, I'm a Black woman, and societal structures, the hierarchy places me at the bottom of the hierarchy. I don't like it very much, but that's where I'm placed because 1, I'm Black, and 2, I'm a woman. And so when you think about it, if organizations set up their systems to support a Black woman, then guess what? All the other workplace uncomfortable practices will be dealt with. People on LGBTQ group will be dealt with. People on disability will be dealt with, because I am actually at the bottom of the societal structure. And so when we want to, you can hear me okay, Alexis? You can hear me all right?
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you.
Oh, beautiful. And so when we deal with workplace exclusion, we actually resolving a whole host of other workplace exclusionary practices. And unless we equipped ourselves to understand that, we are going around in circles. I can almost put my hand on my heart to say we will not be able to achieve gender equality if we don't deal with race equality. Because you just can't. Because race equality is the major category of all the differences. So that means they are the worst. And so if we really put resources in dealing with that, all the other problems, we'll be able to be equipped to deal with them properly. And so this is where I take organization on that journey of looking at exclusionary practices and removing them so that you can cultivate inclusion. So I've got 5 ways to achieve inclusion. And my number 1 is understanding exclusion. See the problem for what it is, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you are getting to the root causes of the problem, and then you'll be equipped with the right tools to be able to incorporate and create inclusion. So I'll go through each one of them a little bit more in details. So we look at understanding exclusion, which is characterized by racism. Racism is based on fear, is based on the physical look of people, and this has actually caused a whole host of generational traumas and so forth. I mean, slave trade came about because of the concept of race. And so you can see how racism actually gave way for us understanding what exclusion is. So if we can understand the structures that causes racism and then attack those structures, then we will be able to achieve inclusion. Now, this core, I'm not going to be able to teach you what racism is. We don't have the time to do that. But what I'm saying is that to use your resources properly and effectively, then this is what the steps that you need to take to really get you closer into getting inclusion. Because another thing I want to tell you is that creating inclusion is not a behavioral problem that you need to solve. It's a system problem. Again, racism is also a system problem. See, we are limited to understanding racism as the slurs on the street, the name calling, and so forth. But racism is in systems. And so you can call me bad names on the street. I might never see you again. And yes, it's quite uncomfortable. And please don't do that if you see me on the street, because it's not nice. And it put me on a situation of high alert. It can cause stress. I'm not able to do anything about it. And it's quite uncomfortable. And it affects people. But the racism which causes me the most disadvantage, the racism that stops me accessing employment, which then affect where I can live, which then affect whether I can afford to have healthcare for my kids, which then affect what kind of car I can drive, food I can eat. Those type of racism is in systems. So we need to really relax about it, and we need to relax about having that frictions with one another. We can work with anyone in our organization if we look at systems and develop systems that support inclusion rather than what people look like. And that will give you much more your money's worth than trying to change people's behavior. And what I say is unconscious bias training or bias training, which is only looking at people's behavior, the language you use. And I've just said to you, what you said to me on the street is not what causes disadvantage. And so we quickly go and engage in training that are easy to implement. And I know that creating inclusion is a little bit of work, but once there are organizations that are doing it, my book, which Alexis has got a copy, there's a whole host of case studies in our book of organizations that are actually doing inclusion very well. And they are very, high-end profitable organizations because they've taken the time to do inclusion. Okay, so understanding racism, the fear of unknown, lack of communication, that's actually what is creating exclusion, not just relationship with people. That's important. And another thing I want to talk about this is that I can work with people that I might not like very much. But if the organization has made it its goal to cultivate inclusion, they will still be a very inclusive organization, irrespective of who's working there. And that's the difference. So inclusion is about a strategy like having a marketing strategy or a sales strategy, and you have steps in achieving that. And so the same way you need to have steps in achieving inclusion. And the steps I showed you earlier, one of it is actually understanding what exclusion is. Okay, so I'll move to the next slide and seeing the problem. So knowledge around exclusion is uncomfortable but necessary. We must name the problem. Exclusion is racism. We need to get comfortable talking about this. We are very, as a society, when we talk about racism, because we've reduced it to relational problems, we think that we are attacking people and we feel really guarded about talking about it. But racism is exclusion, and we need to feel comfortable to normalize talking about racism. It then helps us to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of what the problem is in order to deal with it. And, as leaders, we can't solve a problem that we can't articulate what the problem is. And so we need to spend more time to understanding the problem, and then the solution makes it a bit easier. I work with organizations all the time. And what I find is when I've gone through the inclusion strategy, they actually then are equipped to then create their own anti-racism policies because they understand the problem. Okay, we are very smart people. We don't need training over training and unconscious bias training. What words should I say and things like that, and causing more stress to people to participate in those training when we need to remove that into the system and looking at, and I'll talk a little bit about what type of systems that we need to be looking at in a minute. It's going okay? Thumbs up? Yeah. Okay. So I can go on a little bit. So I'm conscious about talking too much, and I'll just go to the next slide. So we then get to the root causes, developing understanding of racism, how they show up, and what to do about it. And so again, understanding the problem and dealing with the problem. You are then equipped with the right tools. So you collect data. So when I talk about systems, it's about collecting data. Look at the data of your organization. So we can do that very easily with gender because, people identify with the gender that they are, and we can collect those data. When it comes to racism, and that's probably the hardest thing. So you need someone who has got some sort of training in race and racism and anti-racism to be able to help you with that. Because without it, nobody, racism is a very complex system to understand. And so you need someone with that background to be able to help you. They will help you collect the data you need, reviewing hiring and recruitment practices, and also check your retention rate as well. That can give you a lot of information. And once you've done that work, you'll be able to actually incorporate all that data and information into inclusion. And I call it the 3 A's. So you do like a 360-degree assessment of your organization. And often people will say this to me, Gloria, but we don't have any racist bone. Our organization, you know, we don't have any problem with racism. Can I say to you is that every organization, irrespective of who you are, you will have exclusionary practices. And so do that assessment, 360-degree assessment, and find out where the gaps are, because then it will really help you to understand what's going on within your own organization. So for example, Alexis might decide to do a 360-degree of human leaders as an organization and look at processes and procedures, how she's going to cultivate inclusion, so that every experience in that organization is one of inclusion practice. And then you announce. So you do the assessment, but you need to get a buy-in from all your stakeholders. And this is where, you know, your leaders, your middle managers, your stakeholders can be really important here. Announce what you are going to be doing. I mean, I've worked with organizations where they've made gender equality one of the agendas. Will make inclusion one of your agendas, and they have systems in place to achieve gender equality. And this is what I'm helping organizations to do, is that you make inclusion one of your agendas to cultivate. So you announce to get support and buy-in. And then the last bit of the 3 A's is act, because you can't achieve anything without action. So you have action in place and you actually operationalize your ideas and you cultivate inclusion. How are we going with time, Alexis?
Yeah, it's 20 to 1. So
okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. So I'll come back to that definition of inclusion that I started with. And I said inclusion is about providing environments where everyone can feel belonging. So you can see how bias training and things like that are not going to help you to be able to create environment. Environment is the very DNA of your organization. And you need to start thinking about, well, what do I do to create an environment that everyone, irrespective gender, age, religion, creed, race, can feel belonging. And that's, as an organization, I use this definition, but human leaders, your definition for inclusion might be different because of your organization. So always important to come up with your definition, but having the element of belonging is a really important part of inclusion, and having those in there. Okay, so now that I've gone through that short presentation, what's the one thing you would do or change to start cultivating inclusion at your workplace? So I'm not going to do Mentimeter last time. I'm going to get you to put it in the chat, and maybe Alexis might share a couple with us. What is the one thing that you will do, you think, whether in the workplace, it could be in your home, it could be in the community place space, you are a volunteer, any space at all where you have got the control to do one thing to cultivate inclusion, what would that be?
I'll keep my eyes on the chat for you, Gloria. Interestingly though, what comes to mind as you're speaking then is this systemic idea that we can actually remove the personalization of race being something that we need to change our behavior or our attitudes towards. And I think obviously, intention is very important there. And I think many of us intentionally don't feel racist. However, when we are of a certain, for instance, I'm a white woman. So there are certain, obviously the system privileges me in a way over someone like yourself. And that's really uncomfortable to hear, actually, because it's not something, again, that we, I think, as individuals feel as an intentional thing, but it helps us feel, I think, empowered to make change, knowing that we can take our intention and behavior out of that and actually do it in a more systemic way.
I think that is a great comment there, because, and that's what actually demobilizes us. We feel that we've got the right intentions. We are not racist to people, but being kind and nice does not stop exclusioning happening in your organization or in any space. So you can be nice to me. None of you might want to call me names when you see me on the street, but that does not stop exclusioning happening in systems that perpetuate negative outcomes for me. And so if we really want to do something with this, it's not about finding out whether you've got unconscious bias or conscious, because we all have biases, and biases will continue to be part of our lives. But if we want to create a society where we are allowing everyone to participate and contribute to solve problems of the world, and we have a lot of problems, but we are squashing other people participate in that decision making, in that process, that's exclusion that no unconscious bias training is going to ever help fix. And do you know why this propaganda continue to go on? Because unconscious bias training is run by white people. I'm sorry to say this. Very few people of color runs unconscious bias because they know they don't work. These are elementary knowledge where our parents taught us how we behave around people. That's what unconscious bias is. And the back-end information which has created those biases are racism and exclusion. So understand that, then unconscious bias won't be a problem. Understand why those, I guess, intentions and behaviors and beliefs are there in our minds. And they have come about by more serious systemic operation and serious problems, which we don't like to talk about because it keeps the status quo and we just keep going in circles. Organizations are made to do unconscious bias training, and we know they don't work, but it's run by powerful dominant group of our society, and you keep going because the programs that we offer is to dismantle the systems of operation, is to say that have recruitment processes that actually doesn't discriminate, or make sure if people leave your organization, you do a proper interview to find out why they're leaving so that you can fix the problem. And so this is the issue that we are dealing with. And it is very hard because the people that are actually preaching this we are not the dominant group, so we are not being heard. So that's another thing. Somebody wrote in the chat, having inclusive organization is to be heard, and we are not being heard. So let's think about this for a minute. We are the one that are going through the exclusionary practices, and we are saying to you that this is what we can do to resolve it, but we are not being heard. And so how can the problem be fixed? And so it is a difficult one. And I know I'm talking a lot. I should stop. So
no, thank you. And, you know, it's, again, it's uncomfortable because I can't imagine the frustration that must actually feel like when you're on the receiving end of, you know, systems and people telling you what's best, and your voice on how to resolve an issue that directly impacts you isn't heard. It's, when you frame it like that, it just seems simply stupid and such an oversight, doesn't it? Like, it really. Now I'm just going to jump into the chat. We've got some fantastic answers coming through. I'll start with the beginning here. And again, Gloria's question was, what was one thing that we can change or implement in our organization as a leader? William has mentioned here that he works with remote Indigenous communities. He said, we hire Indigenous, but we offer few opportunities for Indigenous workers to have a say in where the funding is allocated to. This would be what we need to take on. So thank you for sharing that, William. I think that sounds like a great place to start. Lewis has mentioned, use curiosity respectfully to ask other team members with tact and kindness to learn more about them and work to help them feel seen, heard, understood, and valued. Harish has written, making job descriptions more inclusion friendly would be of a great help, especially in the countries where language is not English. And lastly, Catherine has shared, I think, open, honest, and possibly anonymous input by all members of the organization to expose how exclusive the organization is. If you were to ask many organizations, either the HR department or senior management, they would tell you that they were inclusive, when in fact they are far from it. And that's perhaps a question I'd love to know more about, Gloria. You know, I've filled in surveys for jobs and things like that here in Australia, and there's often a box to tick, are you Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander? Do you find that people dishonestly answer that out of not wanting to perhaps be at a disadvantage for disclosing such race information? And what is a way that we can encourage participation from the voices we really need to be hearing from in a way that actually is safe to participate?
It's a great question. And you're completely right. I worked for an organization where I was doing research, and I needed to establish how many Africans actually worked in that space. And I got about 10% from HR, the list. And I looked around, I thought, I have seen more Africans than this number. So what you just said, they're not ticking the box, because just by saying African was going to be a disadvantage to them. And it's really problematic. And so we need to create inclusion workplaces to stop that happening. And our workplaces are not. They're not safe for people to be themselves and say who they are, because it's going to be used against them. I know a prominent Australian media character, I think Ray Martin, his name is. He has Indigenous in him. And he said when he started his work in media, he never shared that. And you kind of think, why? Because once you shared it, it's going to be used against you. And so these are the systems that we are saying we need to break it down and resolve it. So now you can see how ridiculous doing unconscious bias training is, because it doesn't help those issues that we are talking about. And that's why we keep going around in circles. A good analogy I used about unconscious bias, and there's a place for it. If the systems are being really challenged and the processes are in place, and you want to bring some sort of cohesion between staff and you want to do that, that's different. But unconscious bias is what we run to. And I use an example in one of the articles I wrote this week, and I said, you know, there's a lot of information about race, smoking will kill you. That doesn't stop anyone smoking. So what we need to do is to look at the historical reasons and the habits which create smoking, and that's what changes it. In the same way, we need to look at why is there actually exclusion? Why don't people feel safe in the workplace? And what I'm saying is because of exclusion, and it's racism.
Yeah, you know, it's powerful, but I think the power in language, you know, focusing on exclusion rather than looking at the things we can do to create inclusion just cuts the crap, so to speak, and gets right to the bottom of what we need to be looking at. And, you know, my background's in organizational psychology. So it's interesting to me hearing you discuss this idea that people of perhaps mixed races or being biracial, they're having this feeling that they need to hide part of them in the workplace. And something we know at, you know, on a psychological level is that lack of integration of self actually causes physiological things in the body like sickness and stress. And, you know, it saddens me to hear that there are groups within our community, within my community, that are showing up to work and showing up to community in different ways every day, having to feel like they have to hide parts of themselves to participate. And it comes back to this word belonging. And it frustrates me because I hear belonging thrown around in organizations at the moment. It feels like a throwaway word. We want to create belonging, but the clear distinction to make is a difference between belonging, that is every human being authentically participating, versus acceptance, and that is allowing people to show up, conform, and then we'll let them in. And that's, I think, the clear distinction that we keep overlooking as organizations as well.
Another thing I share with leaders about inclusion is, think about it this way. Inclusion is for everyone. We all want to feel included wherever we are. It's not just one dominant group up here allowing everyone to be included. If your organization is like that, then you're not inclusive. Inclusion needs to be horizontal, where everyone is welcome and everyone can feel belonging. And that's how I like inclusion to work. And it's really, but to be honest with you, the inclusion that we see is one dominant group deciding who can be added onto it, and that way of inclusion isn't the way to go. If you want to be human leaders, if you want to really cultivate some sort of belonging, then you allow inclusion to be on a horizontal level that allows everyone to participate.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely makes sense. And I just want to recap, Gloria, before we quickly move to some questions for everyone listening, those 5 key takeaways. Now, I've written a bunch of notes down here, and please correct me where I've got this wrong. But the first and the very, very key thing that we've really had highlighted for us here today, that the number one thing in dealing with inclusion is actually understanding the antithesis of inclusion, which is exclusion, which is characterized and rooted in racism. So that's our number one. Number 2 is really seeing the problem, and that this is going to be uncomfortable but necessary, and naming the problem. And I love this, Gloria, that you give us such clarity around language here, and that is, we can't skirt the topic. You know, it is what it is. The quicker we cut the crap and name it for what it is, the quicker we can actually look to find a solution to that. Number 3 being get to the root causes. So really understanding racism and how that shows up systemically in your organization, not just in behavior, but in a systemic way. So number 4 was equipping with the right tools. So again, I really appreciated this idea of using our data to drive this. So again, it removes this human element of opinions, because when we have the data, again, there's nowhere to hide. So I think that's such a valuable way to really frame up what the problem looks like in our unique organization. And then from there, really reviewing those tools and making sure we're keeping a metric of retention. Lastly, incorporate inclusion. And this had the 3 components of assess, announce, and act. And one thing that I really loved when you were speaking about the announce component of that is, for me, and again, coming back to the psychology component of that, when we really announce our intentions, I think it creates a level of accountability for follow through. And, you know, within organizations, when we tell our staff that we're going to do something and we have no follow through, that's so detrimental to the culture in our organizations and then the trust that our team has in us. So I think announcing those intentions, having a clear plan of action really helps keep us accountable. So that was my 5 summary there, those 5 key takeaways, Gloria. Thank you so much. Guys, I would love to hear your questions on this. All right, Harish has written here, do you think all the leaders should work in a foreign country where they feel excluded in order to really understand what exclusion is? Interesting.
I love that question. It's great, isn't it? My husband is actually white, Caucasian, Aussie, as Aussie can be, born and bred. And I love when I thank you for your question, and I'm digressing here, but please allow me to share this. When I take him to, my cultural festivity, he's always the odd one out. And so for the first time, he can feel how it is to stand out than everyone else. So I really love your question. Yes, we should send all managers overseas or somewhere where they can really understand what exclusion is, because I can tell you what, nobody, like I said, I can put my hand in my heart, can cultivate and achieve inclusion without understanding what exclusion is, because how can you possibly do that? And so, when we have those people doing unconscious bias training, we should ask the question, do they understand what marginalization is? Ask those 3 questions. I'll give you another 2. Do they understand marginalization? Do they understand exclusion? Do they understand stigmatization? If they can't tell you that, then their training is not going to move the organization into any inclusion practices. They need to be able to understand those components to help drive change and create inclusion behaviors. So it's very, very important. It's a great question.
Yeah, thank you for that, Harish. And Lewis has just written in the chat here with relation to that not only understanding exclusion, but actually feeling it. And I think that's something that unless you've been the only person in the room of your gender, of whatever, it can be really hard to resonate with that. And it can be hard to feel the fear associated being an only in some experiences. So thank you for raising that question, Harish. Now I'm going to jump to Chris's question. And she said, based on what I've interpreted from the session, is that a listen up culture is paramount to inclusion. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Gloria.
A listen?
Yeah, a listen up culture. So rather than a speaking speaking your ideas, more of a listen up culture.
I love that. Who did that? Was it Chris?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Oh, it's really beautiful. And I hope you can save the chat, because that is really lovely. And you're completely right, Chris. I don't even know what to add to that, because you've captured it. And if we don't hear from people who have been through exclusion, who live through exclusion every day, we need to ask the question. And we are coming to a point in society where we can ask those questions with our employers. Okay, because look at the Great Resignation. People are not just, taking it. They are actually asking the question. And it's not a challenging question. It's about, you've run unconscious bias training year after year. Okay, what are you trying to achieve here? What is it that we're trying to achieve? Are we listening, like Chris said, to people on the receiving end to help us with solutions? Solutions are there, but we are not listening. And that's what you've said is so radically important, Chris. Thank you.
Great question, Chris. Thank you. Now, I haven't seen any more questions coming through the chat at all. So with that, I might take the opportunity to wrap up, Gloria. And first and foremost, to thank you for such an informative session. I'm certainly so appreciative of your ability to cut to the chase and cut to the key issue here and really give us a very practical framework about how we should be thinking about this and dealing with it. So thank you so much for your time today to bring this incredible session to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I was just going to say that I know I have covered quite a bit, and if you're finding it hard to get your head around, I understand that. I'm quite active on LinkedIn. You can send me your questions, and I was just about to share my screen to give you my contact details. Please, let's go back.
Perfect.
There it is. Please get in touch if I can help you or clarify anything I have said. I can help you with that. I'm quite happy. And now and then I pop into the Human Leaders chats, and if I see your question there, I'll try and answer it there. So thank you very much for having me.